On the 5th of February, the third night of the Whitehorn Freeze, Blackpine Reach was gone. The wind ran at 46 miles an hour, and the cold sat near 52 below. Between the barn and the house, there was no ground, no wall, no sky, only white driving sideways in the dark. The porous wall had held. Then the upper brace began to walk, a pin easing out with each gust, and snow started to plug the vent that kept the seed crop breathing. Lydia tied the rope around her waist and put the free end in Rowan Sier's hands. Below the cap, Nell held Ruth's thermometer to the lantern. May lay behind the green curtain. Dace Rusk, who had laughed at the rope, kept the fire watch with a bandaged hand. Sabina crouched over a newborn calf. 360 bushels sat near the freezing line. The liquid in the glass touched the scratched mark. 27 days earlier, Lydia Vanner had owned a tool roll, 2 hungry children, and not the price of a single plate. How does a woman who whispered that she could not pay become the one thing standing between a homestead and the freeze? Late on the 9th of January, Lydia Vanner reached the Crown dining hall with May beneath her coat and Nell walking 1 pace behind. The stage had left them at the granite road 2 hours before dark, and the last of the walk was uphill into a wind that came down off the silver camp with the smell of coal smoke in it. May weighed nothing now. That was the part Lydia did not let herself think about. The fever had burned the child down to something she could carry inside her coat with one arm, and she carried her that way through the door of the dining hall because the windows were yellow, and the yellow meant a stove. She had not come to eat. She had come to ask when the mission house opened its floor. Nell stopped in the doorway. She did not mean to. Her boots simply quit moving, and Lydia felt the small body go still at her hip and knew before she turned what the girl was looking at. At the near table, a big man sat alone over a plate of roast beef and gravy and 3 biscuits, a black-bearded man broad enough that the bench complained when he shifted his weight. He was eating without hurry, the way a man eats who has done a full day and expects another. Nell watched his fork the way a person watches water in a dry month. "Let's go," Lydia said low, close to the girl's ear. "We can't pay." The man heard it. She saw him hear it, the fork stopping halfway. He did not look at Lydia. He looked at Nell, and at the flat of Nell's hand pressed against the front of her coat, where, since the second closed door in Phillipsburg, the girl had kept one thing hidden that Lydia had chosen not to find. He set the fork down. He raised one finger to the woman behind the counter. "2 plates, Rowan Sier said. "Same as mine, for the girls." Lydia opened her mouth. He was already talking to the counter and not to her, which she understood was on purpose, and the plates came fast because the beef was already cut, and Nell looked up at her mother and Lydia gave the smallest nod she had ever given and hated the size of it. The girls ate. May could only take the gravy and the soft inside of a biscuit, and she took it in the slow, careful way of a child who has learned that food can stop. But she took it. Nell ate like the plate might be recalled. A 3rd plate came, set at Lydia's place. She did not touch it. Rowan watched her not touch it. He'd gone back to his own supper, and he let a good while pass. And when he spoke, he still did not look up. "Yours is getting cold," he said. "Theirs was mercy," Lydia said. "Mine would be debt." That was the first thing she said that made him set his knife down and look at her straight. Not the whispering in the doorway. That sentence. She was unrolling the tool roll on the bench while she said it, not to show him, only to get May's blanket free from where it had bound up in the canvas. But the roll came open across her knee, and the tools lay there in the lamplight. A mason's small hammer with a worn ash handle, 3 cold chisels, a plumb bob, a folding rule, and a long leather tray strap coiled around the whole of it, one buckle hole in the strap repaired with a second row of stitching where the leather had once torn through. The strap was too long for the roll. Nell reached over without being asked and coiled the loose end back on itself, tucking the tail inward so the buckle would not catch, the way her father had rolled every strap he ever owned so it could not hang up in the brush. Lydia let her do it. Watching the girl's hands do a dead man's habit was a thing Lydia had decided long ago not to have a face about. Rowan looked at the small hammer. "That for show?" he said. "No." "What is it for?" Lydia looked at his coat where it hung on the peg behind him. There was a smear of soot along the shoulder seam, and she had been looking at it since she sat down. "Your chimney smokes," she said. "That soot's soft and wet. Dry soot brushes off a coat. Wet soot stains it. A flue that runs cold and slow lays down wet soot, and a wet flue means a cold start every morning and a house full of smoke before the fire finds its feet." She paused. "You've a cellar that sweats too, and doors on the north that go under in a real storm." Rowan Sier had not told her one word about his cellar or his doors. He chewed slowly and swallowed. "Who told you my north doors?" "Nobody. A man with your shoulders eats alone in a supper hall in January because the walk home isn't worth making twice. And a place that smokes and sweats is a place a man stops wanting to be inside." She should not have said the last part. She knew it as it left her, but he only pushed the plate she had not touched an inch toward her and folded his hands. "Say it plain," he said. "Whatever it is." So she said it plain. "Feed my girls tonight. Give us somewhere dry until the road clears. I'll make your chimney draw, your cellar hold, and your water drain." She met his eyes. "No wages unless the numbers prove it. If your seed stock lives through the cold that's coming, you owe me $40 and board through the thaw. If it dies because I built it wrong, you owe me nothing past the supper my girls already ate." He was quiet a moment. "I've 160 acres, Rowan said. "A spring, timber, 17 head, and a cellar full of seed I can't afford to lose. And I've had 2 men from Granite look at that chimney and take my dollar and leave it smoking." He turned his water glass, a slow quarter turn. "Why would I hand my winter to a woman I met over a plate of beef?" "You wouldn't, not on my word." Lydia set the small hammer back in its place in the roll. "You'd hand it to me the way you'd hand a wall to a mason. You'd let me name what's wrong before I ever touch it. If I can't read your place from the outside, don't take me up the hill." Rowan considered that. Something in it, the offer to be tested before he trusted her, seemed to sit better with him than any promise she could have made. "You name what's wrong," he said, "before I tell you what I've lost." He said the second part flat, the way a man says a thing he has decided not to explain. "There's a bench in the wagon. Sun's gone. It's 10 miles and a cold 10. He reached above the stove where 2 tin cups hung on nails, took one down out of old habit, and stopped with it in his hand as if he had surprised himself. Then he set it, not back on the nail, down at Lydia's place beside the plate she still had not touched. He did not say anything about it. Neither did she. Nell, who missed nothing, looked at the cup, and then at the biscuit she had already, out of habit, half slipped into her coat, and left it where it was. They came down out of the timber the next morning behind a stage that overtook them on the Flint Creek Road, a light coach with the mail and 1 passenger, driven by a lean man who hauled his team down alongside the wagon and snapped both reins flat against the dashboard before he spoke, the way some men clear their throat. "Sier," the driver said. "You're wanted to know. Telegram came up from Deer Lodge." He was Orrin Pike, and he carried the weather the way other men carried freight. "Stations east are falling off the board. Cold coming. They're calling hard frost for the 3rd of February. Real cold, not January cold." Rowan sat still with the lines in his gloved hands. How hard? 50 below hard, if the front holds its line. Orrin looked past Rowan at the woman on the bench with a child inside her coat and made no remark about her, which Lydia marked in his favor. That's 24 days, and that number's only good if the front doesn't come on faster than they read it. They almost always come on faster. They do, Rowan said. Orrin snapped the reins again. You'll want the road marked between your buildings before it hits. Man froze in his own yard below Phillipsburg 2 winters back, 40 feet from his door. He touched his hat brim to Lydia, not to Rowan. Ma'am. Then the coach went on up the grade, and the sound of it was gone in under a minute, swallowed by the timber. 24 days. Lydia turned the number over. It was not a large number for what she had seen on the man's coat. How much of the potato is in the cellar? She asked. 360 bushels of seed, Rowan said. 74 of barley. It goes to the spring market at Granite and Phillipsburg, both. Miners want new ground broke. They want seed. He did not look at her. I owe $612 to Granite Supply and Loan, due the 1st of March, borrowed against saw gearing and roof and seed. If the seed doesn't sell, the note comes due and the lender takes the spring lot and the timber contract first, and without the spring, the rest of it isn't worth the fences. He clicked to the team. That's what I've lost, part of it. The rest you saw last night. My wife's been gone 4 winters. He said the last of it in the same voice as the debt. Lydia let it be the same voice. She had learned that grief handed to you plainly should be taken plainly, and not turned over in your hands where the other person has to watch you do it. Blackpine Reach sat on a bench of land above the spring, a low log house and a barn, and a stone-faced cellar dug into the slope, and Lydia was down off the wagon and walking the buildings before Rowan had the team unhitched, May bound to her chest, and Nell trailing with the tool roll held in both arms like something that might spill. She walked the whole of it once without touching anything. That was how her father had taught her. You read a building the way you read a face, all at once, before it can compose itself for you. She came back to where Rowan stood with the harness over his shoulder. 3 things, she said. Your smoke's not clearing the ridge. Watch it. They both watched. The smoke came up out of the chimney and then flattened and rolled down along the eaves instead of lifting clean. That's a cold stack and a bad draw. That's your wet soot and your smoky mornings. Second, she pointed at the north wall of the house, where the ground lay bare and scoured brown against the logs while snow held everywhere else. Wind strips the snow off that wall clean. Snow's a blanket. Bare ground there means the wind's got a straight run at your coldest side, and it's taking your heat off it every hour of every night. Third, she walked to the cellar door and laid her bare hand flat on the stone beside the frame, then on the frame itself. The stone was dark and dry. The wood of the frame wore a white fur of frost all around its edge. Your cellar leaks air here. Warm air's finding the frame and freezing where it meets the cold. You're losing the room through a gap you can't see because the frost is drawing you a picture of it. Rowan looked at the frost line around the door as if he had walked past it 400 times, which he had. You said 3. He was not gentle about it, but he was not unkind. There's a 4th. You missed it. Lydia turned. She had missed something, and she felt it before she found it. Then she saw it, over the low roof of the potato house, dug into the bank, a faint smoke of vapor rising off the sod where the roof should have been holding the cold hard on top. Warm, damp air coming up through the pile from underneath. That, she said. The pile's breathing wet. The bottom's warm and damp, and it's driving moisture up through the stack toward the roof, where it'll freeze on the top layer and rot the bottom. You've spoilage starting from both ends at once. She said it without any pleasure. I missed it because I was reading the house. You knew it was there. I knew something was there, Rowan said. I didn't know that. He set the harness on its peg. Ruth kept the cellar, my wife. I never had to learn it, and then I had to, and I never did. He said the name once and moved past it. There's a lantern by the door. Inside the cellar, the air was close, and it smelled faintly of rot under the earth and potato smell, and Lydia cut into the pile with a shovel and lifted out a potato from 2 feet down and cut it through with the small blade she kept in the roll and turned the cut face to the lantern. A dark ring ran under the skin, wet at the center. How long? Rowan said. Not long. Weeks if you leave it. The damage moves up. She wiped the blade. We don't warm this room first. Everybody's mistake is to warm a cold cellar. You warm a wet cellar, and all you do is drive the wet up into the coldest potatoes at the top and lose the whole stack faster. She stood. We dry it and move the air first. Then we hold it. In that order, or not at all. That was the first rule she gave the place, and Rowan Sier stood in his dead wife's cellar and heard a stranger give it, and did not argue, because he had cut open enough soft potatoes by then to know a wet room when he stood in one. They started at first light on the doors, because a door you cannot open in a storm is the first way a place kills the people in it. Lydia set 2 plank baffles, one before the house door and one before the cellar, each standing 3 feet 6 inches out ahead of the existing frame, with the opening in the baffle offset 2 feet to the side, so the wind could not drive straight at the door and pack it. She rehung both doors to swing inward, so a drift against the outside could not seal a man out, and she raised each threshold 8 inches above the old worn grade. When she set the frame for the cellar baffle, Rowan crouched at the base of it and pressed his thumb into the ground where her corner post wanted to go. That stone under there heaves, he said. Old frost lens. It'll lift your post by March and rack the whole baffle. Set it a hand to the left. You're on gravel. Lydia looked. He was right, and there was no way for her to have known it, and there was every way for a man who had dug this bench for 20 years. She moved the post a hand to the left onto the gravel. Gravel, then, she said. You've the ground memorized. It's my ground. He said it without heat, and that was the whole of it. She did not defend the first placement. He did not make her feel the correction. The frame went on the gravel and held true, and neither of them said anything more about it, and something between them settled a small amount, the way a wall settles onto a footing that fits. To test the doors, she scattered a handful of bran at ankle height in the gap of the outer baffle while Rowan opened and shut the inner door. The bran eddied and turned inside the baffle and did not cross the threshold into the room. The offset had broken the wind's straight line. That holds, she said. The chimney was the second morning. She pulled the loose mortar off the shoulder where the flue turned, fitted a low iron clean-out door above the hearth footing so the turn could be raked clean, and cut a short bypass channel so a small twist of kindling could be lit to warm the whole stack before the heavy fire went in. Rowan trimmed the timber back where it ran too near the hot masonry because she showed him the char on it, and he did not like the char. She lit a paper twist first with the bypass shut. The smoke stalled at the cold turn and rolled back into the room and set them both coughing. She opened the bypass and lit a second twist, and the warmed stack took hold and drew the smoke up clean and fast, and the difference was a thing you could see with your eyes and not argue with. That's your wet soot done, she said. Warm the stack, then feed it, never the other way. The third thing was the seed itself, and for that she made Nell a tool. She cut a flat stick of pine and notched it twice, and she gave it to the girl in the cellar with the lantern between them. "We're raising these bins 14 inches off the stone," Lydia said, "with 3 air channels running under each row and slats across the top spaced the width of your thumb so the pile can breathe from underneath. Every gap between the slats has to fall between this first notch and this second notch. Wider, and the potatoes fall through. Tighter, and the air won't move." She put the stick in Nell's hand. "You measure every gap. If it's wrong, we pull the board and cut it again. You're the judge of it." Nell did not smile. Nell had not smiled since Ohio. But she took the stick, and she went down the first row on her knees with the lantern, and she checked every gap, and near the far end she stopped. "This board closes half an inch at the far end," Nell said. It was the most words she had said together since the dining hall, and not one of them was about herself. Lydia pulled the board. It had closed half an inch at the far end. She cut a new one, and Nell measured it, and Nell nodded, and that nod was worth more to Lydia than the $40. That night there were 4 potato cakes on the breakfast skillet at supper, though there were only 3 at the table old enough to eat them: Lydia and Rowan and Nell, with May taking milk. Rowan slid the 4th onto the board beside Nell's without a word, then frowned at the skillet as though it had miscounted, and said the count had come out wrong, and left it there. Nell ate it. She left the dried dining hall biscuit where it was, wherever that was. But she ate the 4th cake. The wiped blade test proved the bins on the 4th morning. Lydia slid a shovel blade wiped clean under the old pile and drew it out, and it came out filmed with damp that beaded in the lantern light. She slid it under the new raised slats and drew it out, and it came out dry. "Off the floor and breathing," she said. "Now it'll keep long enough to matter." The team came from the road on the 6th day, a clean sleigh with 2 good horses, and the man in it was Bram Toller, the largest timber and cattle man in the valley, and he had a way of folding every paper he touched into quarters before it went in his vest, which he did now with the tally sheet in his hand as he looked at the half-built wind wall taking shape west of the barn. "Sier," Bram said, "you hired a supper-room widow to braid you a fence." Lydia did not stop weaving slash into the uprights. "Which of your barn doors faces the prevailing wind, Mr. Toller?" Bram looked at her. He did not answer, because the answer was the west door, and the west door drifted shut on him every hard winter, and everyone in the valley knew it. "I came for my horses," Bram said to Rowan, and folded the tally sheet another turn. "The pair I said you could rent for your stone hauling. I've a cut up at the North Strip, needs them now." It was true. He did have a cut. He also had every other day of the winter to reclaim them, and he had chosen this one, with the stones still to move and the frame of the wall waiting on it. "Business, Sier. You understand business." Rowan understood it. He unhitched Bram's pair and handed the lines up without a word, and Bram folded his paper a last time and drove off with the horses that were to have dragged the stone sled up from the creek. So they dragged it themselves. Lydia and Rowan, and a third, a broad woman who had come up the day before leading a single ox and offering 2 weeks of work and her own animal knowledge in exchange for 20 bushels of protected cellar space. Sabina Holt, a widowed stockwoman and midwife who knotted her scarf twice at the throat before she took hold of anything heavy. The 3 of them and the 1 ox dragged the loaded sled up the last grade to the cellar by hand and by lead rope, and it took the whole afternoon, and Rowan tore the heel clean off 1 glove on the sled rail and worked the rest of it barehanded and said nothing. Lydia saw the bare hand. She pulled her own dry gloves off and held them out to him at the top of the grade. He looked at them and did not take them, so she set them on the stone by his hand and picked up the rope again, and after a while she saw that he had put them on, and neither of them remarked on it, and the stone got moved. The wall was the big fix and the contested one, and she framed it that afternoon, lodgepole upright set 30 inches deep, 42 feet out from the barn corner to the west-northwest, 7 feet 4 inches at its tallest, running 60 feet past the barn line at either end. Between the uprights she wove willow and pine slash. And here she made her choice. She wove the lower half of it near solid, tight, and close, to stop the strongest wind that came at the ground. Rowan watched her weave the bottom courses tight and said, "The wind doesn't hold northwest after dark. It drops off the granite slope come night and crosses the barn out of west-northwest, near a point off where you've aimed." "Then we'll see it after dark," Lydia said. She kept her alignment. She wanted the squall to tell her, not the man, and that was pride, and she would pay for it. She left the wall aimed as she had framed it and wove the bottom tight. While the wall went up, two things came out of the house that no one explained. In the closed front room Rowan had never used since Ruth died, under a canvas sheet stood a settle of maple and pine, one arm fitted and finished smooth, and the other still rough-sawn, unfinished, waiting. Nell went in for a lost mitten and came out having found the settle instead, and she said nothing about it, and she did not touch it, but she went back twice that day to look at it. And Sabina, hunting a windbreak cloth for the cellar mouth, brought out a folded curtain of green wool from a chest, woven close, and held it up. And Rowan looked at it for one long moment and then said, "That can hang at the cellar door," and turned back to the wall. Dace Rusk brought the last load of willow bundles the 8th day, a teamster who rubbed his thumb across a chipped front tooth before he laughed, and he laughed while Lydia paced off the ground between the buildings and drove marker posts. "Tie enough string between your buildings," Dace said, thumb going across the tooth, "and maybe the weather'll trip over it and break its neck for you." He laughed, but while he laughed he took hold of the guide rope she had strung between two posts and leaned his whole weight back on it quietly to see if it would hold a man, and it held. And Lydia saw him note that it held. The early squall came on the 9th day, ahead of anything Orrin had promised. 11 below, a wind near 28 miles an hour, 2 hours of hard-driven snow off the west-northwest. Not the freeze, a rehearsal for it. It tested everything at once, and most of it held. The offset doors stayed clear, and the inner ones swung free. Lydia lit the bypass, and the flue drew clean on the first twist. In the north room, the candle held at the seam nearly upright, where a week before it had lain flat. The raised bins stayed dry beneath. The wall did not hold. Where she had woven the lower half solid, the wind hit it like a cliff and dropped everything it carried on the near side, all at once, in a steep bank instead of spreading it out downwind. Lydia went out into the squall with 3 strips of cloth and tied them to the uprights at 3 heights, and she watched them, and the truth was plain and physical and hers. The strips at the top whipped and streamed. The strips behind the solid lower half hung dead still. The wind was not passing through. It was climbing over, and where it climbed, it dumped its snow, a wall of it building against the barn, and the drift reached the lower barn hinge in less than 40 minutes. From the road, 2 of Bram Toller's hands sat their horses and watched the barn go under behind the wall the widow had built, and then Bram himself came up the track in the blowing snow and reined in and looked at the steep bank of drift climbing the barn wall. "Built yourself a fine place to bury a barn," Bram said. Lydia stood in the wind with the dead cloth strips snapping at the top of the wall and the live snow packing the barn door, and she did not look at Bram Toller. She looked at the drift and at the tight lower weave she had chosen against the word of the man whose ground it was. "I made a cliff," she said. 20 days of window left, a wall to take half apart, and the real cold still out east on the wire, coming on faster than anyone had read. The wall came apart in the gray of the 10th morning, and Lydia took it apart herself, so that no one could say she had let another hand do the undoing of her own mistake. She pulled every third bundle of slash from the uprights and threw it down, and where the lower half had stood woven tight, she opened it out until daylight showed through the whole face of it, top to bottom, an even thing now instead of a solid skirt with a fence above. Then she went to the last section, the 60 feet running past the barn, and she and Rowan pulled the end posts and reset them, swinging the whole run 9 degrees off where she had first aimed it, around to meet the wind that came off the granite slope after dark, the wind he had named and she had not believed. West-northwest after sundown, she said, setting the last post. You called it. I built to the day wind. Most do, Rowan said. He tamped the post. The day wind's the one you feel on your face when you're working. Nobody builds to the one that comes when they're asleep. She let that be true and did not add to it. The retest was the same test, the 3 cloth strips at 3 heights, and she tied them on again while the wind was still up from the squall's tail. This time they all 3 streamed, top, middle, and low, all of them pulled out level and live, because the wind was passing through the open weave instead of climbing over a wall. And the snow that had built a cliff 2 days before now laid itself down in a long, shallow tail that ran 40 feet out past the barn and never came near the hinge. There, Lydia said. A wall that stops every wind only tells the snow where to stand. This one slows it and lets it lie down easy. Rowan looked at the shallow tail of snow where the cliff had been. He did not say she had been wrong, because she had already said it, and he had learned by then that Lydia Vanner did not need a thing said to her twice. That evening she pulled her gloves off and set them on the cellar stone and worked barehanded at the daubing, and after a while Rowan noticed the bare hands and set the gloves back beside her within reach, which was the same move she had made on him at the top of the grade, and neither of them said one word about the gloves going back and forth between them like a thing being minded. The daubing was where the second failure lived, and it was a failure of a different kind, and it taught her a lesson the wall had not. She had chinked the north wall of the house, and the dairy room, and the cellar head wall in the way she had always chinked a wall, quarter pole blocking driven into the gaps, moss packed soft behind it, and over the hole an outer coat of the clay-heavy daub she had mixed 100 times in Ohio and along the freight line. Clay and a little sand and water worked to a body that spread smooth and set hard. It went on well. It looked right the evening she finished it. The first hard night after took it apart. She came out in the morning and the outer coat had shrunk and curled away from the logs in flat plates, some of them already dropped to the ground, and where they had pulled back the joint stood open again to the cold. She held a candle to the north wall inside, and the flame bent sideways at 3 cracks that had not been there when she went to bed. The wall moved, Lydia said. My mix didn't. She stood looking at the curled plates and could not, from her own experience, say why. She had used the clay she found on the place because a mason uses the clay she is standing on, and the clay had failed her, and she did not know its temper. Rowan crouched and worked a curled plate off the log and crushed it in his palm. Blackpine clay, he said. It shrinks bad. Dries into plates every time, straight off the bank. You can't run it as the body of a daub. He turned the crushed clay over. Ruth knew it. She cut it. Cut it how? He went into the house and came back with the ledger, a bound book gone soft at the corners, his dead wife's hand running down the columns. And he opened it not to a column but to a margin, where beside a household account for lime and salt, she had written a proportion in a small, close hand, the way a woman writes a thing down not to teach it, but so she will not have to remember it. 2 measures creek sand, 1 measure clay, a handful of chopped horsehair, a small measure of sifted stove ash. Lime wash worked into the outer coat to bind it. Lydia read it twice. Sand to open it so it doesn't shrink to plates, she said, working it out aloud. Hair to key it together, ash and lime to harden the face. She looked up. Your wife had it right and I had it wrong, and I've been mixing daub since I was a girl. You've been mixing Ohio daub, Rowan said. This is Flint Creek clay. It isn't the same ground. She did not argue the point, or improve on Ruth's proportion, or add anything of her own to it to save her pride. She mixed it exactly as the dead woman had written it, 2 sand, 1 clay, the hair, the ash, the lime wash on the face, and she troweled a test patch onto a length of log by the stove and let it set, and then she carried the log outside and left it in the cold overnight. In the morning, the patch had not curled. It had stayed keyed to the wood, gripping the grain, and when she pressed it with her thumb, it held. Ruth's mix, she said. And that was the whole of the credit, said out loud so the girl could hear it, and so the dead woman's name sat in the room a moment. Then she mixed a batch and went to work redoing the north wall, and most of it would hold through everything that came. One corner, worked last and in failing light, would open again under the storm, but that was 3 weeks off and she did not know it yet. Elias Morrow came on the 12th day, a road overseer who had been a mine timber boss before that, 56 years old and slow-moving, and he carried a folding knife and used the handle of it to tap any timber he doubted, twice, and listen to the sound it gave back. He tapped the cellar's main roof beam twice before he had said good morning. "You're the mason," he said to Lydia. It was not a question. "Show me the flue." She showed him the flue, and he did not laugh at any of it, which she had half expected. He asked hard questions instead, and every one of them cost her work. "Where do you clean the turn under the shoulder?" Elias said. "Soot builds at a turn. A flue that can't be raked is a flue that catches fire in its 3rd year." She showed him the low iron clean-out door she had fitted, and he grunted and let it pass. "How do you warm the stack without filling the room with smoke first?" She showed him the bypass and lit a twist to prove it, and he watched the smoke go up clean and grunted again. "How much timber's behind the hot face?" That one she had to think on. Rowan pulled a plank off the interior wall behind the chimney shoulder and found a floor joist run closer to the hot masonry than either of them had liked, and he cut it back and widened the clearance until Elias stopped looking at it. "Can you see every joint that can smoke?" Elias said at the cellar, tapping the beam again. "We were going to plaster that seam closed," Lydia said. "Don't. Plaster it, and the first time it smokes, you'll be tearing a wall down in the dark to find where." He put the knife away. "Leave a gap you can hold a light to. A joint you can see is a joint you can fix. A joint you've buried is a fire waiting on a bad night." They left a narrow inspection gap along the seam instead of closing it. "How's a body clear that vent?" Elias said, at the cellar's high corner, "after the outside door's gone under a drift and nobody's getting out to it." Lydia had not built the vent to be cleared from inside. She fitted removable wooden rods that ran up through the shutter so the frost could be knocked out of it without a soul going outdoors. "What tells you the potatoes are heating?" Elias said. "Before your nose does. Before you can smell rot, they're already gone." 3 readings a day, Lydia said. Low, middle, high, and a wiped blade held over the pile. If it films, there's damp rising. "And what writes it down?" Elias looked at her. "A number in a man's head is a guess by supper. You'll have 3 good weeks of numbers and no way to say which fire ran hot and which night the damp came, unless you write it." So Ruth's ledger came back into service, her old headings still at the top of the page in her own hand. Date and outside reading and cellar low and middle and high, fire started and wood added, wind, damp found, loss found, work changed. Lydia added 3 columns of her own down the side. Test used, person who read it, next inspection. And she gave the book to Nell. Elias watched the girl take the ledger and set it under her arm, and he crouched to her level, which he did for no adult. A number's no good without the hour beside it, he told her. You write the time on everyone, or it's only a guess with ink on it. Nell wrote the time on everyone after that. The heat bank was the largest of the systems, and the one Elias had come chiefly to see. Lydia built a low firebox outside the wall of the storage chamber, so no flame ever sat under the seed, and ran the smoke channel from it through a thick interior bench of stone before it joined the warm chimney, the stone to soak up the heat the fire made and give it back slow through the night, long after the fire was down. She left the inspection gap between the hot masonry and the floor timber that Elias had demanded, and a bypass to pull the draft straight while the fire was lighting. It's not a stove, she told Rowan while she laid the last of the bench. A stove throws heat while it burns and quits when it's out. This holds what the fire made and hands it back through the cold hours when there's no fire at all. You fire it to charge the stone, not to warm the room. Rowan heard her. Rowan did not, when it came to it, believe her, and the first firing proved it. They lit it on the 17th day, and it worked. The stone warmed through, and the cellar came up gentle and even, and Nell wrote the readings in Ruth's book under Ruth's headings. Low bin 33, middle 33, high 34, and it should have stopped there. But the outside reading kept falling that afternoon down past 20 below, and Rowan stood at the firebox and watched the outside thermometer drop and could not make himself sit still while the cold came on. He fed the fire. He fed it the way a man feeds a stove when the weather turns. More wood because it was colder out, more wood again, and the cellar readings that evening told the truth of what he had done. The upper bin read 41 degrees. The lower bin sat near 32. He had driven a heat gradient straight up through the pile. Lydia wiped a shovel blade and held it above the upper potatoes and drew it out, and it came away filmed and beading. That's damp climbing, she said. You warmed the top and the wet's going up to meet the cold at the roof, same as the pile did before we ever touched it. Rowan looked at the film on the blade and at the 41 on the glass and at the outside thermometer he had been feeding the fire to answer. I built the fire like the wall was a stove that wanted feeding, he said. It isn't. It's a bank. He said it flat, taking the whole of it, no reaching for the cold as an excuse, though the cold had been real. I drove it by the weather. It's meant to be driven by the stone. You promised to fix it, Lydia said. You never promised to guess right the first time. She said it to him the way it had likely been said to her once, and it landed, and it was the first time she had handed him the same grace he kept handing her. They divided the fuel into measured bundles after that, and made a rule of it. No new wood while the inner stone face still read above the ledger mark, whatever the outside thermometer did. The weather could scream. The stone would tell them when to feed it. That was the pressure, and after the pressure came a quiet scene that the days had earned. It came the evening the front room opened. May, who had begun to follow Rowan from room to room, holding her wooden horse by one leg, followed him to the door of the room he had not used in 4 winters, and he opened it for her without thinking because a 2-year-old was leaning on it, and once it was open, he did not close it. He carried a lamp in and set it on the sill of the window, and the light stood in that window for the first time since Ruth died, and from the yard it looked like any other lit house. Nell went in behind them and found the settle again under its canvas, one arm smooth and finished, one arm rough. She lifted the corner of the canvas and looked at the underside of the seat, where there were carpenter's marks in pencil, a joiner's layout, the spacing of the tenons ticked off along the rail, and she looked at them a long moment, and then she took out her own notched measuring stick and copied the marks onto the back of it, quietly, and put the canvas down. That was also the morning the dried dining hall biscuit turned up on the window sill of the bunk room, set out beside a scatter of crumbs for the birds. Nobody had asked her to put it there. Nobody remarked on it. Lydia saw it on the sill and left it on the sill, and it stayed there, and the birds took it. And that was all that was ever done about the biscuit that Nell had carried since the second closed door in Phillipsburg. 2 cups stood by the stove every morning now. Rowan had taken to setting them out before Lydia came in, and for the first days he had quietly moved the second one, Ruth's cup, back to its nail before anyone saw it there. Then a morning came when he did not move it. He set out 2 and left 2, and poured into both, and said nothing. And Lydia said nothing, and the cup stayed. The drain-back line was quicker work, and it did not fail. The old wooden water line to the barn had a hidden dip in it where water stood and froze, and every hard morning Rowan had been thawing it or hauling from the spring by hand. Lydia lifted the whole run to hold a continuous fall back toward the spring and took out the low spot and fitted a shut-off inside the barn so the line drained itself empty after every use and had no standing water left in it to freeze. She moved the barrel back from the door so no spilled water could ice the threshold. To test it, Nell tipped a cup of brawn into the last rinse, and they timed how long before it showed at the spring outlet, and the whole line ran clear and drained back clean. "That's water through the storm," Lydia said. "For the stock, for the Calvine if it comes, and for a fire if we're ever fool enough to need it in a freeze." The vent was where the 4th failure lived, and it was the strangest kind because it came of the system working too well. She had built the vent pair to move the damp. A low intake on the sheltered east side, a high exhaust at the far roof corner, both with sliding wooden shutters and the removable rods so frost could be broken from inside, and a fine wooden lattice over each to keep the mice out of the seed. And it worked. It moved the air and held the damp down, so well that on a night when the outside reading fell hard, Lydia slid both shutters closed to hold the warmth the stone had banked, because the room was doing so well she did not want to bleed a degree of it. By morning, the underside of the roof cap beaded with condensation, and the top straw over the seed had gone damp. "I closed it because it was holding," she said, "and there was the whole of the failure in it, a thing done for a good reason that made a new problem. Sealed it up tight to keep the warmth, and the warmth had nowhere to send its wet, so the wet came out on the coldest thing in the room, which is the roof." She wiped a white cloth along the underside of the cap, and it came away wet, and she showed it to Nell, because Nell was the judge of the readings now, and needed to know why a room could be too tight. "So it's never all the way shut," Nell said, working it out. "Never all the way shut. The low intake stays open 1 finger's width any time the high reading runs more than 4 degrees over the low. Warm and wet always wants up. You give it a small door up and out, or it finds the roof." They made the rule, and Nell wrote it in the margin under Ruth's headings, in her own hand now, with the hour beside it. The cold snap came on the 15th day of work as a graded test, 27 below for 6 hours through a still, hard night, no wind to speak of, only the deep cold. It was not the freeze. It was a proving of the systems the freeze would try. They ran it by the book. The heat bank fired by the stone's reading and not the weather's. The vent held 1 finger open at the low intake, the readings taken and written every hour with the time beside them. And the numbers came out good. The cellar held between 31 and 34 the whole 6 hours. They burned 5 armloads of wood, where Rowan, before any of this, would have burned 8 to hold a room half as well. The lower potato samples came up dry to the wiped blade. Elias came out the next morning and read the whole run of it in the ledger, hour by hour, and cut 2 potatoes from the low bins himself and held them to the window and found them sound. It held, Elias said. He set the ledger down. 6 hours. He looked at Lydia, and there was no unkindness in it, but there was no gift in it either. It held 6 hours in a still cold. That is not the same as holding 3 nights in a wind that won't quit and a cold twice as deep. Don't you dare call this proof. I don't, Lydia said. I don't believe your system will hold what's coming, Elias said. You shouldn't, Lydia said. Not until it does. He looked at her a moment, and something in the answer satisfied him more than a boast would have, and he named the last precautions before he left. Sand buckets set beside both fires, the clean-out raked clear and left clear, a spare vent rod cut and kept inside, the repair tools tied together in one satchel so nothing walked off in the dark, one adult awake at the fire every hour of every night, and no soul crossing the yard once it blew without a hand on the guideline. Then he took his knife and his slow walk and went back down the road. The 2 lost days went to the fuel bundles and the vent rules, testing and marking and locking them down, and those 2 days pushed the last of the bracing work, the guideposts and the cellar cap braces both, back into the narrowing end of the window, which was a cost, and Lydia felt it as a cost. Bram Toller came a last time before the freeze, in the clean sleigh, and he did not mock this time. He had a folded paper ready in his vest. I'll make it simple, Bram said, unfolding the paper and folding it again the other way. I'll buy every bushel where it lies, sound or not, at a fair figure. I'll take up your note to the loan, the whole 612, and I'll leave you the house to live in through to May while you find your feet. He held the paper out. Take a price while there's still something to price, or let the weather decide, and price nothing. Rowan looked at the paper and did not take it. He knew what the offer was. It was the spring and the timber strip he had refused $450 for once already. Come round again dressed as a mercy, timed for the week a man is most afraid. Bram was not a liar, and it was not a cheat. It was only a good businessman buying a thing the day before he believed it would fall. No, Rowan said. He did not make a speech of it. He folded the paper back along Bram's own creases and handed it back. We'll let the seed answer for itself. Sundown tomorrow. The offer's good, Bram said, and put the paper away and drove off, and that was the 3rd time. He thinks we'll lose it, Rowan said, watching the sleigh go. We prepare for 4 nights, Lydia said. A forecast owes us nothing. Whatever the wire says, we build for worse than it says. Orrin Pike came up the road near dark that same evening, with frost caked along his eyelashes and the team blowing hard, and he did not get down. It's moved, Orrin said. Fronts come on faster than they read it, same as I told you they do. It's not the 3rd anymore. They're calling the leading edge for the 1st. That's 2 days sooner and colder on the front of it than they first said. He wiped the frost off one eyelid with a knuckle. You've what's left of tonight and tomorrow. Mark your road, Sier, whatever else you don't finish. 2 days gone off the window with the night's warning, the guideposts still to string, the cellar cap braces still single where they needed to be 3, the last inspection pin still to drive. They worked through that night by lantern, Rowan setting the diagonal braces and driving the iron inspection pins while Lydia strung the guide rope post to post through the eye loops and knotted it at arm's length so a hand could count its way home, and hung the lantern box on the lee side where the wind could not reach the flame. She buckled Owen's leather trace around the repair satchel last of all, cinching the tools into one bundle the way Elias had said, and she did not think about whose strap it was while she did it, because there was no time to. They were driving the last inspection pin into the cellar cap brace, Rowan holding the brace and Lydia swinging the maul, when the wind that had run steady out of the west-northwest all afternoon did a thing that stopped them both. It stopped. The whole valley went dead still. The slash in the wind wall quit its hiss. The lantern flames stood straight up in the box and did not lean. For 10 full breaths, there was no wind at all off the granite slope, and the smoke from the house chimney rose in a single straight line into a sky the color of a healed bruise. Rowan raised his head from the brace and looked at the still smoke. "That's the lie," he said quietly. The pin was still half driven when the wind came round. Not out of the west-northwest now, but hard off the north, all at once, a cold that took the breath at the top of the chest, hours before any wire had said it would. By full dark on the 1st of February, the yard was a thing you set up by hand and by memory, because the wind had already taken the site of it. Lydia drove the last marker stake at the cellar door and threaded the guide rope taut through its eye and felt down the line with her mitten, knot to knot, an arm's length between each, all the way to the barn and back. The lantern hung in its lee box where the flame could not be reached, and it burned steady while the world went to pieces around it. The fuel stood split into marked bundles inside both doors, so nobody would guess in the dark how much to feed. Sand buckets by each fire. The water barrel hauled off the threshold, and the line drained back empty. The repair satchel cinched shut with Owen's trace and hung on its nail by the cellar door. Nell followed her mother down the rope with a hand on it and asked why there was both, or a light in the box and a rope in her hand, when either one showed the way. "A light tells you where home is," Lydia said. "A rope tells you whether you're still going toward it. In a whiteout, a man can walk straight at a light and pass it by 10 feet and never see it. The rope doesn't let go of you." Nell carried Ruth's ledger inside her coat where it stayed dry. May's bed was moved behind the green wool curtain, hung now across the corner of the front room where the stove's warmth pooled. The scratched thermometer had come off the front room wall and gone onto the central post of the cellar, where Ruth had once scratched a line at 28 degrees. The reading, her ledger said, below which she had first seen surface injury take the stored potatoes. Lydia read it aloud as they finished. 32. Nell wrote it with the hour beside it. Out in the barn, the 17 head stood with their rumps turned to the west before the wind was even loud, feeling it come the way stock feels it before a person can. The forest went silent, and Rowan stood in the barn door and looked at the last of the straight smoke tearing loose off the chimney and said the calm had been a lie, which they had both known, and now the truth of it was on them. The first wave came in the small hours, and it held as the work had been built to make it hold. The frost climbed the old exterior stone of the house the way frost climbs, a white bloom spreading up the logs. And it climbed to the line where Ruth's mix began, and it stopped. On the old work, the cold walked straight up the wall. On the new daubing, it found no crack to walk through, and the bloom died at the seam like a tide against a stair. The offset entrance trapped a shallow curl of drift in the baffle, exactly as it was meant to, and the inner door swung free against it. Rowan lit the bypass twist, and the warm stack took the main fire clean on the first light, no smoke rolling back into a house full of sleeping children. The cellar held at 32. Far off across the black they could hear cattle bawling, carried on the wind and then torn away from it. Bram Toller's stock, though there was no seeing that far, only the sound of it coming and going. "It's holding," Nell said at the ledger. "It's the first night," Lydia said. "Don't trust a thing on its first night." But she said it gently because the girl had earned the small hope and would not be let keep it long. The second wave was the cold coming down in earnest, and it brought the disagreement that had been waiting since the first firing. The outside reading passed 40 below in the black hour before dawn, and Rowan came in off the fire watch with the cold rolling off his coat and reached for a fuel bundle to feed the bank harder, because 40 below was worse than any test they had run, and every instinct in a man who had wintered here 20 years told him to answer a deep cold with more fire. Lydia put her hand flat across the firebox door. "The stone's still giving," she said. "Read it." "It's 40 below, Lydia. It's worse than the snap. The snap was 27. He had the bundle in his hand. "And the bank reads above the mark still, which means it's still handing back the heat we put in it. You feed it now, and you don't warm the cellar, you warm the top of the pile, and we're back to a wet roof and rot climbing, in the worst cold of the year with no way to air it out." She did not move her hand. "The weather doesn't set this fire. The stone does. That's the whole rule, and it's colder tonight, which is exactly when the rule matters." Rowan stood with the bundle in his hand and the outside glass reading a number that frightened him, and he looked at the stone face reading, and then he looked at the cellar ledger where the low bins still sat at 32 under a fire he had not fed, and he set the bundle down. He set it down before the next reading came to prove her right. That was the thing. He did not wait to be shown. He took her word against the evidence of his own cold skin and put the wood back on the pile, and the reading an hour on held at 31 and proved her, but by then it was already an old argument. Neither of them said a word about what had just happened between them, that a man had followed a woman past what his own senses were screaming at him. There was no time to say it, and it did not need saying. Nell wrote the reading down with the hour beside it and did not know she had just watched the whole thing turn. The third wave opened the wall. Somewhere past midnight of the second night, a log joint let go near the north corner. Not one Lydia had daubed, but a corner she had worked last and fastest in failing light, the mix a shade lean, the key not full. Hours of the cold contracting the timber had worked it, and it opened, and the candle in the north room fell flat on its wick, and snow dust began to sift into the dairy room in a fine, dry stream you could see in the lamplight. They went to it from opposite sides, because it could not be reached from one. Rowan held the shutter half open against the wind, and held the lamp where it would light the joint without the wind killing it, his whole body a windbreak for a single flame, and Lydia drove moss into the moving joint, and behind the moss a narrow wooden wedge to hold it. The joint was live. She could feel it work against the wedge as the wind pulsed. And Rowan, without being asked, tore a strip of local fir bark and passed it across because fir bark compressed into a live joint without splitting where a hardwood wedge would have cracked it. She packed the bark. The joint took it. The candle came upright. Neither of them called it a rescue. Each of them had held the thing the other could not reach, and that was the whole of it, and it was not the first time and would not be the last. The rope jerked once, out in the dark, and then it went slack, and then it drew tight and held tight. That was the fourth wave, and it was the mockers. Rowan tied himself to the house end of the guide rope, and Lydia took the second line, and they went out into a wind that had erased the barn 30 feet away, moving knot to knot, counting the knots allowed into the wind because the wind took the sound out of your own head. At the barn, the rope angled down under a drift, and past the barn it should have run to the cellar, but there was weight on it that did not belong to the wind, dragging. They found Dace Rusk 3 knots past the barn, crawling, and crawling west, away from every building, away from the lantern, his shoulder hooked over the guide rope by the pure luck of a falling man. He had come from Bram's place with news and lost his horse and lost the wind's direction, which is the thing that kills men in whiteouts, and he had crawled the wrong way with total conviction until his shoulder caught a rope. He had once leaned his weight against to mock it. His coat was frozen, bored stiff at the knees. He was reaching when they got hands on him toward a smear of light he had finally seen, and it was the lantern. And Rowan knocked his reaching arm down, because a man that cold does not go to the fire. A man that cold goes under dry wool and against another body's warmth and comes up slow, and going fast at heat after freezing is how you lose the hands and the feet you were trying to save. They brought him in knot by knot and stripped the frozen outer layers and put him under dry wool by the stove, not on it, and warmed him against Rowan's own side. His first clear words when his jaw would work were not about the cold. "I saw the light," Dace said. "I saw the light, and I couldn't get to it." His thumb went toward his chipped tooth out of old habit and stopped, because his hand would not do it yet. "The rope. My shoulder caught the rope." "Bram's place," Rowan said. "You came from Bram's." "His wall." Dace shut his eyes. His plank wall buried the barn doors. Solid plank, no gaps, and the drifts up over the top hinge. His hands were cutting through the loft when I left. He got the rest of it out slow. "I came to tell you the freeze is worse north of here than the wire said." May came out from behind the green curtain in her nightdress, with the wooden horse in one fist and her wool blanket dragging from the other, and she stood looking at the shaking man on the floor by the stove, and then she pushed the blanket at him, put it against his chest, and let go of it. Dace, even shaking, tried to push it back to the child. May took the corner of it and held it down against him and shook her head once and would not take it back. So he kept it. Nobody made her a speech about it. Nobody made her one after. The fifth wave came up out of the barn, where the red heifer had gone into labor in the worst cold of the year. Sabina got to her first and had her hands on the calf before Lydia and Rowan came through the barn door. One foreleg was presented right. The other lay back along the body, folded wrong, and the calf could not come while it lay that way, and the heifer was tiring in a cold that would kill a wet newborn in minutes if it ever did come. "Forelegs back," Sabina said. "It has to be brought round before she can pass it, and I can't turn it and hold her both." She had her scarf knotted twice at her throat, and her sleeves shoved up past the elbow in air cold enough to hurt. Rowan could turn the calf. Rowan could not turn the calf and hold the laboring heifer down at once, and there were not enough hands until Lydia opened Ruth's ledger to a page Nell found for her, a short note in Ruth's hand from a birth years gone, a calf that had come with a foreleg back, and the sequence Ruth had used to bring it round written down the way she wrote everything down so she would not have to trust her memory in a bad hour. Lydia read the sequence aloud, step by step. Sabina worked at the shoulder to make room. Rowan reached in and turned the calf by the plan the dead woman had left, and Lydia kept clean, warm water coming off the drain-back line, which ran because it had been built to run. And Dace, still shaking under May's blanket, held the lantern steady, because holding a lantern was a thing his hands could just manage. Nell kept the ledger dry inside her coat and read the timing out, minute by minute, in a voice that did not shake, though she was 8 years old in a barn at 40 below. The calf came weak and slick and steaming into the cold, and for a long moment did not breathe, and then it did. They got it into the protected barn corner Lydia had bedded deep and out of the wind against its mother, and it lived. Ruth Sier had turned that calf. Nobody said so out loud, but her ledger had, and it was her ground, and she was in the barn that night as much as anyone who was breathing. The sixth wave was the wear failure, and it was the quiet, frightening kind. Not a thing breaking loud, but a thing giving out slow because it had been stressed too many times. Around the collar where the high vent passed up through the roof cap, the wood had been heating and cooling for 2 nights running, expanding and shrinking with every rise and fall of the fire, and now the collar had loosened in its seat, and fine snow was working in around it. And at nearly the same hour, at the inspection gap by the heat bank, the gap Elias had made them leave open so a joint could be watched, a thin gray smoke began to show, meaning the flue itself was leaking at a seam under the long strain. Lydia called the fire drowned. Rowan hung one beat on it because the outside reading had fallen below 50 now, and to drown the fire was to give up the only heat they were making. Lydia wiped the white cloth at the gap, and it came away gray. That settled it. He emptied a sand bucket over the firebox and closed the draft, and they went into the longest fireless stretch of the whole storm. The stone bank alone against 52 below, nothing to do but watch a needle fall and trust the mass to carry the gap. 32, then 31, then 30. Rowan planed a tapered wooden sleeve by lamplight to reseat the loosened collar, and Lydia climbed and reset it from inside and packed the joint, both of their hands needed, neither able to do it alone. And when the collar was set and the smoke seam had cooled, Rowan reached toward the firebox to relight too soon, before the flue had cooled enough to be safe to inspect and refire, and Lydia closed the iron door against the back of his hand. "Not yet," she said. "It has to cool before it lights, or you're lighting a leak." He waited. The needle read 29. The 7th wave was the peak, and it was the one the whole winter had been walking toward. The upper witness cord on the cellar cap brace. The cord tied slack across the joint so that if the joint moved, the cord would pull straight and show it. Pulled straight. Lydia saw it go from slack to taut in the lantern light and knew before she reached it what it meant. One of the 3 iron pins had walked halfway out of its joint under 2 nights of the wind, loading and unloading the cap, and the brace had loosened, and with the brace loose, the snow shield over the low cellar roof lifted a little with each gust, and each time it lifted, Spindrift drove into the vent opening and began to plug the one path the seed crop had to breathe. And the cellar ridding, with the fire long drowned, was falling toward Ruth's scratched line. The joint could not be reached from beneath. It had to be reached from the outside, on the lee slope of the cap, in the full of the storm. Lydia buckled the guide rope around her own waist and put the free end into Rowan's 2 hands. "If I go, you pull," she said. Not before. She did not stand. She crawled the lee side of the cap, where the wind was a fraction less, one hand ahead of the other, the repair satchel dragging by its shoulder cord. The ordinary cord snapped, worn or frozen brittle, or simply the wrong weight for the load, one of the failures she would write down later, and the satchel with the hammer and the iron pin and the wedge in it started to go, and Owen's leather trace, buckled round the satchel where she had cinched it 2 nights before without a thought for whose it was, caught on the replacement loop and held. The tools did not vanish into the white. A dead freighter's habit of a strap kept the one bundle that could save the crop from going into the dark. She reached the anchor point. Her first strike with the hammer missed the pin clean because she could no longer feel her fingers around the handle, and she set the pin by looking, not by feeling, and swung again. Rowan braced the rope around the doorpost and held it and did not pull, because she had said not before, and below them both. At the central post, Nell held Ruth's thermometer to the lantern and called the numbers up through the wind so Lydia would know how much time the crop had. 29, Lydia drove the fresh iron pin. 28.5. She wedged the brace hard against it, and the shield settled and stopped lifting, and the wind's pull went down into all 3 braces the way it should have from the start. 28. The vent, with the shield no longer lifting, began to shed the spindrift that had plugged it, and the choked air of the cellar started, slowly, to move again. Nell watched the glass. The liquid slid down toward Ruth's scratched line and touched it. Touched the 28-degree mark the dead woman had cut into the glass years before against exactly this bar and stopped. It did not pass it. It hung on the line, and then, as the vent cleared and the stone bank kept giving what little it had left, it held. Lydia struck the rope twice with the hammer, the signal, and only then did Rowan take up the slack and bring her back down the lee of the cap knot by knot. She reached the entrance and could not work the buckle at her own waist, her hands past all use, and Rowan did not fight the frozen strap. He cut it through with his knife and got her inside rather than leave her one breath longer in that wind for the sake of a buckle. Inside, in the dark, with the fire still drowned and the stone carrying them alone, he said the only thing there was to say. "The wall's given us till morning." And Lydia, with her hands shoved under her arms and the feeling coming back into them like fire, said the only answer. "Morning is enough." At the first gray of the 4th of February, the wind fell off enough to relight, and the flue had cooled and inspected clean, and Rowan lit the bypass twist, and the stack drew, and the fire came back into the drowned firebox and began slow to warm the stone again. The lowest reading of the whole night, written in Ruth's ledger in Nell's hand with the hour beside it, was 28 even. It had touched the line and not gone under. Nobody said they had won. There was nothing yet to say it about. Rowan went out to the coldest bin, the one hard against the outside wall where the cold would have bitten first, and cut one potato from it, and brought it in and cut it through, and turned the face to the gray window light. The center was firm, white and firm, all the way through, no dark, wet ring. He held it out to Lydia without a word, and there was something starting up in his face that was almost hope. "That tells us about one potato," Lydia said, and they sat down to wait for enough light to open the bins and learn about the rest. The 4th morning began with a book, not a celebration. Nell opened Ruth's ledger to a clean page under the old headings and set the ink pot where it would not freeze, and Lydia stood over her and named the failures one at a time so the girl could write them down, and there was nothing in Lydia's voice that made any of them smaller than it was. The wind wall woven too tight, the first daubing mix too heavy with clay, the heat bank overfired the first night, the 2 vents closed together, the high collar worked loose, the brace pin walked out, the repair cord too light for its load, only the 1 spare iron pin stored at the cellar, where there should have been 3. Nell wrote them in her small, careful hand, one to a line, the hour of each beside it where she had it. "Every one of those lived through the night," Rowan said, watching the list grow. "Why write down the things that held?" "They didn't hold. We caught them." Lydia looked at the list. A thing that nearly failed and got caught is a thing that will fail next time if nobody wrote down that it tried. A weakness shouldn't be let to hide behind a thing that lived. She put her finger by the last line. "Write what failed, not what we felt about it. What failed and when." Nell had started to write the whole sentence. A weakness shouldn't be let to hide, and Lydia reached down and stopped her pencil. "Write what failed," she said again, and Nell scratched out the beginning of the sentence and wrote only the plain list, which was the whole lesson. They opened the bins when the light was full. They did not open the easy ones. Lydia had them cut samples from the worst positions first, the north upper bin where the cold came down, the north lower where the damp had always wanted to pool, the center of the deepest pile, the door side bin that took the draft every time the cellar was entered, the bin hard against the outside stone wall, and Sabina's stored 20 bushels in their own corner. Each potato cut through the center and held to the window, one after another, and the numbers written down as they went. The loss was real, and it was honest. 18 bushels showed the surface chilling or the damp injury, a dark band under the skin, ruined for seed, ruined for keeping. Of those, 6 were still sound enough at the core to eat in the next weeks and would not be wasted. 12 had to go to the stock quickly before they turned. 4 sacks of barley near the old wall showed damp along the outer grain, though most of that could be dried and saved. Against the loss stood what had come through 342 bushels sound. Of those, 324 met the seed standard. Clean, firm, fit to sell to the miners breaking new ground in the spring. 70 bushels of barley, saleable or fit to use. All 17 head alive in the barn, and the red heifer's calf alive with them, weak, still, but nursing. Nell drew the 2 columns without being told, because she had learned by then that a truth wants 2 columns and not 1. Lost on the left, saved on the right. 18 bushels against 342. 4 damp sack edges against 70 sound. 1 vent collar against a cellar roof and a heat bank that held. 1 brace pin against 17 head of cattle. She totaled the seed that met standard and set it beside the debt, and the figure cleared the $612 with a narrow margin left over an away. Narrow, but over, and the note would be paid on the 1st of March, and the spring lot, and the timber would stay Rowan's. She wrote no words at the bottom. The 2 columns said it. Elias Morrow came up the road when it had cleared enough for a wagon, and he read the whole ledger, every hour of it, the good readings and the failures, both, the list of the 8 things that had nearly gone. He cut his own potatoes from the coldest corner and held them to the window and found them firm, and he set them down and would not credit the system with 1 degree more than it had earned. Did not make heat, Elias said. Understand what you built before you go telling anyone what it does. It did not defeat the cold. There's no defeating 50 below. He tapped the central post twice with his knife handle, the post with the scratch thermometer still on it. What it did was slow every path the cold could use. The wall slowed the wind. The bank held the heat you made so you didn't have to keep making it. The vent moved the wet before it could rot you. The rope kept your people. It kept you from wasting the heat you had. He put the knife away. That's not a small thing. But it's the true thing, and you'll say the true thing or you'll build a fool's copy of it next time and freeze. That was his validation, and it was worth more than praise because it was exact. Dace Russ came and went without waiting to be thanked. One morning there was a wagon load of straight brace poles set beside the cellar with no one there, every pole cut to length for 3 braces where the old ones had been cut for 1, and the caps notched clean and true. He did not knock. Later in the spring he took paid work stringing guide ropes along the granite road for the county, knots at arm's length, because he had crawled a wrong mile in the dark and learned in his own body what the rope was for. Bram Toller came last, in the clean sleigh, and there were 4 empty halters hanging on the sleigh rail where there should have been cattle. He had lost the 4 to his own plank wall, the solid wall with no gaps that had buried his barn doors under a lee drift and left the stock exposed until his hands cut through the loft. He did not say he had lost them. The 4 empty halters said it. He walked the wind wall first, and then the cellar cap, and then he crouched at the brush wall and put his hand into the open lower weave where the wind ran through. "How much did you leave open?" Bram said. "Below the 3rd rail." "Enough for the wind to pass and lie it snow downwind," Lydia said. "Not so much it stops holding the drift off the cap. It's a balance, and I got it wrong the first time and had to open it back up. It's in the ledger, the wrong version and the right one both." Bram cut a potato from the coldest corner himself, the way Elias had, and found it firm and stood a while with it in his hand. "I want the plans," he said. "The wall, the vent, the way you set the braces in 3s. What do you take for it?" "Site and a measured plan, and 2 days of me on your ground while your hands build it," Lydia said. $68 in the materials. Bram had bought and sold enough to know the figure was fair, and to know she knew it, and he did not try to talk her down, and Rowan standing beside her did not open his mouth to soften the price or make it a neighbor's favor. Bram unfolded a bill from his vest, folded it once the other way out of pure habit, and counted out the first half into Lydia's hand. He did not apologize. Apology was not in him, and Lydia had not asked for it. He asked one more technical question about the height of the wall against the drift, and then he drove off. And that was the conversion. Not a sorry, but a bill counted out and a real question asked. The method spread the way a true method spreads, one need at a time. At Bram's own place, they pulled down the solid plank wall that had buried his barn and set a porous section in its stead, farther out from the doors, and cut a loft escape door on the lee side so no stock would be trapped again, and replaced every single brace with 3. Lydia would not leave the job without the witness cords tied across the joints and the inspection dates written where a hand could find them. A person can copy the shape, she told Bram's foreman, who wanted only the picture and not the reasons. The shape won't tell you why it stands where it stands. You build my wall 9 degrees off the after dark wind, and it does nothing. You seal it solid to keep more wind off, and you bury your own barn, same as this one did. The reason is the thing, not the shape. At Sabina Holt's place, they raised a slatted platform in her small cellar and cut a low protected intake and a high vent she could clear from inside, and Lydia started her a plain temperature ledger with the hours ruled in. Sabina traded 2 weeks of spring calving help and paid $12 in cash, and Lydia took both and set a fixed figure for the next, who asked, $3 to come look, 8 for a measured plan, a day's wage and board to stand on the job while it was built, and not one unpaid widow's favor among them. Rowan backed the terms every time by saying nothing and letting her name them. Then March came, and the debt was paid on the first of it in granite with the seed sold to the miners, and the spring roads opened, and the bargain Lydia had struck over a plate of beef in January was finished, every letter of it. The seed had lived. She was owed her $40 and her board through the thaw, and the thaw had come. She packed the tool roll. Nell rolled Owen's shortened trace around it, the strap Rowan had cut through at the cellar door in the storm, mended now and shorter by the cut, coiled the way her father had coiled it. The girl's handcart stood by the door with the little that was theirs already in it. Rowan did not make a speech. He was not a man who could have, and a speech would have violated the whole of what had been built between them, which had never once been spoken. He put a paper on the table instead, written out in his own slow, square hand, and he did not say a word about it. He set it down where she would read it before he said anything at all. Lydia read it standing. Nell and May were to have shelter at Blackpine Reach for 7 years, guaranteed, whatever passed between Lydia and Rowan, agreement or no agreement, marriage or none. Lydia was to have 1/3 of the net from the stored produce and from every structure she designed. Her tools remained hers alone. No design of hers would be sold without her name on it and her consent to it. If Rowan died, Lydia might stay through 2 full planting seasons. If Lydia left of her own will, her earned share stayed payable to her, and a small sum yearly into Nell's own name for the keeping of the ledger. Lydia read it twice. "You're giving me a share of your own ground," she said. "I'm not giving you what was mine," Rowan said. "I'm naming what you already carried." Elias Morrow signed it as a witness, and Sabina Holt signed it under him, and it was done. And it was a legal and a practical thing before it was ever anything spoken. At the stove, Rowan set out the cups. "Stay until the ground opens," he said. "The ground's open," Lydia said. "It opened last week." "Stay through planting, then." Lydia closed the tool roll and set it down, not in the handcart, on the shelf. "Longer than that," she said. By August, the winter was a hard thing to remember, and the wind wall had become a danger nobody was looking at. The corrected brush wall had stood through the spring and dried through the early summer, and the grass beneath its open lower weave had cured to tinder, and the neighbors who had copied it had copied shorter versions of the same, and along 60 yards of it, the woven slash had gone from a thing that broke the winter wind to a continuous unbroken line of dry fuel. And because it had proved itself in February, because it had earned its place and paid for itself in seed, nobody walked it anymore, nobody examined it. A thing that has saved you once is the easiest thing in the world to stop watching. A slash burned 2 miles off through a spark on an afternoon wind, and the spark found the cured grass, and the grass found the western end of the wall, and the wall, built to slow wind, began instead to carry flame along its whole length toward the barn and the new hay. The very feature that had saved them was the thing that damned them now, the open lower weave that had let the winter wind pass through and lie its snow down. Easy was a flue at the base of the fire, feeding it air along its whole run, pulling the flame east toward the buildings faster than a man could walk. Rowan wanted every hand and every bucket on the wall, soaking it. "Water won't outrun it," Lydia said. She was already looking down the 60 yards of burning brush. "You can't wet 60 yards of dry slash faster than the fire eats it. Wet the near end all day and the far end's already past you." "Then what?" "We cut it. We take gaps out of it ahead of the fire so the flame runs into open ground and dies for want of anything to carry it." She was pulling the tools even as she said it. "A break it can't cross beats a wet spot it goes around." "Open the line and you throw sparks into the yard," Rowan said. "Cut a gap and the wind carries embers straight through it onto the hay." And here was the second season crisis's true test, which was not the fire, but the two of them under it. Nell ran into the house and came out with Ruth's ledger open to the original wind wall page, the measurements from January. And Lydia read the after-dark wind bearing off it, and stood, and read the smoke and the bend of the flame in the afternoon wind, and saw the 2 points where the prevailing wind would carry the flame away from the buildings, and not toward them. "There," she said, "and there. Cut the gaps there, and the wind bends the fire off the structures, not into them. I have the bearings. They're in the book." They cut the first gap where she said, 16 feet of the wall pulled and dragged clear, and the lowest dry brush raked off the ground down to earth. And Rowan, working the second cut, stopped and moved it. Moved it uphill of where Lydia had marked, because there was a shallow grass swale there he could see, and she could not. A hidden run of cured grass that would have carried the fire around her gap if he had cut it where she said. "Swale here," Rowan called. "Grass in it. Your gap's good, but the fire will run this low grass around the back of it. Cut it uphill of the swale." "Uphill, then," Lydia called back, and did not argue it, because it was his ground and his eye for the lay of it, and she moved the cut uphill without one word of defending her first mark. He had given up the barn defense he wanted for her measured gaps. She had taken his correction on the swale without a breath of argument. Neither of them insisted on being the whole of right. That was the thing the fire was really testing, and it held better than any brace. Bram Toller came at the dust with a breaking plow and a good team, and cut the outer fire line where Lydia pointed, turning a black furrow of bare earth around the far end, so the fire could not run past into the open range. He took her direction without pretending the plan was his, and he lost the brim clean off his hat to a gust of flame, and did not lose one head of stock, and when it was over, he did not stand around to be told he had helped. Nell had her own real work, and it was not a child's pretend of it. She measured the break widths and called them out, and marked the safe posts in the ledger, and then she took May by the hand and led her and the wooden horse to Sabina's stone yard out of the fire's reach. And she stayed there with her sister until Lydia sent word it was safe, and she came back only then, and not before, because she had been told a real thing and trusted with it, and she did it. The fire jumped the first wetted section, as Rowan had feared it might, and it ran east, and it died at the measured earth gap, ran into the 16 feet of bare ground, and found nothing to carry it and went out along that line like a candle pinched. The hay was scorched down one side. One winter panel of the wall was burned to nothing. The barn stood, and the stock in it, and the new calf, and Ruth's settle where it sat near the open door for its oiling. It was shorter than the freeze, and it was smaller, and no soul and no animal was lost. But it taught the thing the winter had only hinted at, that a system which works once has not earned the right to go unwatched, and that the very thing that saved you in one season can turn on you in the next if you stop looking at it. They rebuilt it right. 16-foot gaps cut through the wall at measured intervals now, permanent, so a fire could never again run its whole length. The lowest dry brush kept raked off through the fire season. Green willow screens made to drop into the gaps and be pulled out again. Bare earth breaks scraped around every end post. And the winter panels marked to be set into the gaps only after the first lasting snow, and pulled out again at the thaw. The wall now a thing that changed with the season instead of a shape that stood the same all year and waited to betray them. That was the last iteration, and it went in the ledger like all the rest. Nell finished the settle with Rowan in the cool of the evening after, fitting the rough arm that Ruth had never fitted, working to the pencil marks under the seat that she had copied onto her measuring stick in the winter, the dead woman's own layout carried forward in a child's hand. She set the last peg and sat back and looked at it. The two arms matched now, and she asked the only question there was. "Does it stay in this room?" "Longer than that," Rowan said. An ember drifted down out of Rowan's sleeve where it had caught in the burning, an hour dead and harmless, and it fell near May, and May started to cry at the small orange fleck of it, and Nell caught Rowan's hand and put it toward the ember and said, "Pa, there, once, only once." And Rowan crushed the ember out under his boot and said nothing about the word, and the narration will not stop to turn it over either, because it was said once and meant once, and did not need holding up to the light. The next morning there were 4 cups drying beside the stove, 2 large and 2 small tin ones. Nobody had announced it. They were only there the way a thing is there when it has become true. An unnamed circuit preacher married them in the front room later that season, a short plain ceremony with the door standing open. Elias Morrow witnessed it, and Sabina Holt beside him, and Dace Rusk stood near the door with his hat in his hands, and Bram Toller did not come, but a wagon of seasoned pine boards arrived at Blackpine Reach the day before, with no note on it and no name, and everyone knew the boards for what they were. No one narrated what anyone felt. Rowan opened the front room door before the first guest came, and it stood open through the whole of it, and it was still open after the last of them had gone. May crossed the front room that afternoon without a hand on the wall or the furniture, all the way across on her own 2 feet, and set the wooden horse Owen had carved up onto the finished seat of Ruth's settle, and left it there. The Whitehorn Freeze had shown no mercy. It came for every weak place Blackpine Reach had, because the cold finds everything. It found the poor clay and the overfed fire and the shut vent. It found the loose collar and the walking pin. It found the light cord and the one spare where there should have been 3. It found every weakness the place had. It only failed to find one hidden out of pride, because there were none left hidden. Everyone had been measured, or owned, or written in the book in a child's hand with the hour beside it. The same rule saved them from the fire. A joint you can see is a joint you can fix. A wall you still watch is a wall that won't turn on you. And a family holds by the same law a house holds by, not because it is strong, but because correction can travel through it in both directions, and no weak place in it is left standing alone. Rowan never rescued Lydia. Lydia never rescued Rowan. They gave one another work worth doing and proof worth trusting, and that turned out to be the whole of it. The debt papers kept beside Ruth's ledger, not over it. Owen's shortened trace hangs beside Lydia's hammer on the wall. The scorched green curtain still hangs at the cellar door with its burned corner left plain to see. The scratched thermometer is still on the central post, the old line at 28 with 3 pencil marks below it now from later, easier nights. Morning light comes into the front room. May's wooden horse sits on the finished settle, and beyond the window the brush wall runs toward the barn and stops. A clean gap of summer earth cut through it, and then begins again, no longer one unbroken thing pretending it can stand the same in every season.